Yes, indeed, quite a lot of recovery in these IT stocks right now. Several factors at play, and chiefly right now is a sigh of relief where the US market is concerned because we could be looking at interest rate cuts soon. Of course, this would have larger ramifications. Looking back at 2023, what the markets have done, what the economy in India has done, is all worth a revisit. We'll do that with Mayuresh Joshi, the head of equity at William O'Neill India. Great to have you with us on this edition of India Tonight, Mayuresh. You know, we've seen this bull rally in 2023. Then we wondered if this would continue when we had a lean patch around October and early November. The large caps had taken a big knock. And look at us right now, Mayuresh. We're hitting new highs. We're doing it on a daily basis. You know, we're always clever on hindsight, but I want to insist that you look back for us and tell us which of the factors that moved the markets to a higher orbit this year, which ones did you see coming and which triggers surprised you or took you off guard?
Evening, Vikram. Always a pleasure to be on your show. I think two factors which obviously are aiding Indian markets significantly better than most markets across the globe. And to a large extent within the emerging and the developing pack, both our macros and our micros are holding up pretty well. I think one of the biggest surprises was how we have maintained macro stability, whether it is the fiscal deficit number and the expectations in terms of maintaining the glide path that the exchequer had put forth a couple of years back. And again, with crude prices coming off, trade deficit, the kind of FPI inflows that are coming in. I just read a Twitter feed which says there is an increase of $2 billion and the forex reserves are close to 606 billion as we speak. So the confidence that comes through in terms of fiscal and the macro stability, along with the political stability, with the mandate that has been received in the state elections as a precursor to what might happen in the general elections to come. I think a combination of all these factors is probably aiding the kind of macro growth that we see, which is probably missing across the globe as we speak. To support the macro growth, obviously micros and corporate earnings have held up pretty well. Now, the large expectations that the market probably have, Vikram, for next year is a 13 to 15% earnings growth and a 10 to 11% the year after that. So I think on a combination of both these factors, and if you peg earnings growth in terms of the current valuations, obviously markets are not cheap, they are fairly valued. But to that extent, I think the high growth potential that India has over the next few years in terms of consumption trends, in terms of capex spends by the center, by private companies, will lead to a huge amount of manufacturing and infra boom. And that will probably keep our markets in fine fettle. Add to that, the domestic investors, Vikram, let's not forget that, have poured in money across the markets. And that provides a huge kind of support in terms of any dip that probably comes through. So no structural downside that the markets are probably seeing at this juncture or witnessing. But to a large extent, macros, micros, both supportive, have been the biggest surprise factor, not just for emerging economies, but across the developed world as well.
Pointing out, Mayuresh, and correctly so, that we are not inexpensive right now. We seem to be fairly valued, but we are a fairly dynamic market. And like all markets, we often see knee-jerk reactions as well. What about the core, the actual state of the economy? You did mention macros and micros actually working in tandem, but we always assess whether or not there is froth in the market, judging by the strength of the economy. And that emerges through several kinds of macro data. It comes in what you see, what you hear on the ground. To that extent, how grounded in reality in the Indian economy and its growth story is the current market euphoria? Because that gives a clear visibility, a path of growth for the markets too.
So I think a lot of foreign flows are feeding onto the fact, Vikram, just to put in a pointer here, that India is a high growth market and will continue doing so. Now, certain aspects in terms of key macro data points that all of us track. One, I think the fiscal numbers are looking very, very good as we speak. The tax collections have been extremely robust. The GST collections have been extremely stable around that 1,75,000 mark. The direct tax collections, the budgeted expectations for this financial year are close to 18.23 lakh crores. A large part of expectations going by the first 6 months collection, and where a large bulk comes in the last 3 months. That number might exceed by 1 lakh crore, to say the least. And that gives a huge amount of fiscal headroom and fiscal comfort. Add to that the kind of deficit financing that India as a growth economy is expected to have, the kind of flows that can probably come through, even in the next financial year, assuming the Chinese markets still remaining extremely soft, a lot of global markets still expected to take at least 3 to 4 quarters to recover and steady recovery, will mean a good amount of flows coming through. And let's not forget the inclusion of India in the bond index. From April 1st, you'll have significant flows even on the bond market that will probably come through. So I think if you picture all this, along with the expectations in terms of how manufacturing activity is getting pegged through, the PMI numbers are looking extremely robust at this juncture. And at certain points of time, when you're looking at how the savings trend is expected to continue over the next few years, we are close to around 2,300 in terms of our GDP on a per capita basis. It's a known fact, and you would have also read articles that once you hit that threshold of 2,500 in terms of purchasing power parity, you are probably expected to see tremendous amount of growth coming forward. Yes, there might be some niggling worries in terms of inflationary factors which are hitting rural India at this juncture, some elements in terms of spending patterns getting delayed by a couple of quarters. But I think the government is doing whatever is needed in terms of grain releases as we speak through the FDF mechanism, and also some food increases through FDF. So I think some increases in food prices are also given to support the rural economy through the distress that we are probably seeing. But apart from that, I think the next few years, the growth expectations are fairly well placed for it.
Yes, one red flag would possibly be, like many experts have pointed out as well, the RBI's measures to be able to control inflation and subsequent interest rate hikes that we've gone in for, that with the lag effect might slow down growth. But also the other factor is external. The Fed looks all set to cut rates in the first half of next year, Mayuresh. What do you see of the current rally in the Indian markets, what we've seen in 2023? How is that going to change as the Fed pivots next year? How will it affect FII inflows, for one? I asked you today when the rupee became stronger on the back of those dollar inflows.
So as I mentioned in my opening remarks, Vikram, I think FIs will have hardly any optionalities left on the table in terms of emerging economies, and India will have a bulk of those flows. As China recovers, obviously some flows will go to China. So you have to keep some eyes on that as well. But I think India will continue receiving a good amount of flows in the next financial year as we speak. Having said that, I think the kind of expectations that FIs are building in with all the facts and figures that are probably laid out, a large part in terms of the growth dynamics that India has to offer also probably comes bottom up. So you're right in probably saying, and a lot of analysts probably believe that that the broader markets are seeing huge amount of overvaluations in certain pockets, and one needs to be cognizant of that fact. So we are fairly valued, as we said, even in the broader pack. Now, does that zone from fairly valued goes to overvalued zone in the next few months? There is a high possibility to look at the liquidity, the kind of flows, and the lack of optionalities on the table. But I think where the froth might build up might be companies where corporate governance is an issue, where liquidity still remains to be a big concern, where leverage continues to be a concern at this juncture. And with the rising tide, all boats have risen. So I think retail investors specifically should be very, very careful in certain pockets where I think all these elements are probably present. The prices might have gone up, but I think as the markets pivot, probably with the rate cuts, as you rightly pointed out, expected in the second half, a lot of activity happens in terms of emerging market flows as well. And therefore, I think a lot of FPI stroke FI money can be expected to come through, apart from the bond money, which is expected, which is again a huge positive for them.
Well, of course, there are several moving pieces, and there are always chances, Mayuresh, of black swan events toppling India's apple cart, and you correctly pointed some of those out. There are the unknowns, there are also the knowns, and India could be vulnerable to some of them, crude oil price fluctuations, geopolitical tensions, perhaps populist measures as well ahead of the elections. Which ones will give us troubled nights? That remains to be seen, but the going is good right now, and the road ahead looks quite promising. Mayuresh Joshi, always a pleasure getting in your perspective. Thank you very much for joining us on this edition of India Tonight.
Thank you so much.
We'll take a very quick breather on that note here on this edition of India Tonight. There's so much more coming up on the insurance sector. We're looking at several factors that are going to be at play when it comes to the markets come next week. But all of that on the other side of this break. Do stay with us.